Good morning, team. Am I coming through on video? Just making sure. Do we see what's going on? Have we seen the sunrise? Have we seen it? I'm using a different browser. Yes, I am coming through. Okay, because it's not, there's two screens in the studio and one of them. Okay, great, great, great. Coming through. Excellent, excellent, excellent. We'll see how it goes. We'll see how it goes. Weirdly, yesterday I used Chrome, and that was the solution, I think, to the quality problems and everything. But today it just wouldn't work. It wouldn't find the iPhone camera. It wouldn't find the mic I wanted to use. It was as if I'd never used it in my life. So Google not working so well, but who cares about Google? The sun is up, right? We're good. We're good on the sun. Excellent, right? I checked. Bitcoin's running. All that's left to do is have a coffee, talk about what's new. Hmm. Brandon mentioning that the mempool is filling up. So I didn't notice that. I just noticed that we were ticking along, right? 1 second. We just had a broken dish in the room, so tending to it. So everything's running, right? We're good. We've had our coffee. Let's talk about what's new. The fakest news I could find today, the absolute fakest news that I could find, was on MSNBC. You got to go check out MSNBC sometime and just go into that world because it is something else. I go in and I check out what's going on and I just read headlines or read a couple articles. They had one on, the Pope that just died. They called him Pope Rottweiler instead of Pope Ratzenberger. It's a pretty good nickname. Um, and maybe one day we'll talk about the Vatican and all that stuff. Not today because there's so much else going on. Of course, they had to cover the Brazilian situation. We're going to talk a lot about Brazil today. They had a bit of a January 6th yesterday in Brasilia, and they've occupied some buildings, and there's been a lot of interesting developments. But of course, Bolsonaro didn't fall into the same trap Trump fell into, which was to go to the protests and all of that stuff, because it looks more and more like J6 had a lot of framing to it, let's say, right? January 6th had a lot of framing. I don't know if it was designed beforehand, but certainly was being dealt with in real time in a way that a narrative could be strung together. You can even see now, if you saw what Biden did, for example, President Biden on Friday, a lot of ceremony around January 6th. And it looks like it's going to be, probably anyway, from what I gather, it looks more and more like it's going to be their election platform, right? The same way that the Charlottesville hoax was Biden's actual, said it out loud, election platform. But so Bolsonaro not in Brazil. Where has he gone? To Orlando. So this is the actual MSNBC headline. Just look at how they connect stuff here. It's really, I gotta hand it to them. This is good stuff, right? This is actually persuasive. This is a way to get a shot um, in such a sneaky and devious way. It's evil, it's wrong, but it's good. So former Brazilian President Jair, I always forget how to pronounce his name in Portuguese properly. Bolsonaro was apparently in search of somewhere that made him feel more at home. So he's in Orlando, right? And these days, no place gives off that dying democracy feel quite like the state of Florida. That's pretty good. That's pretty good. That's Joy Reid. That is pretty good stuff. So you get audio crackling. Yeah, that's sound good now. Audio is crackling. So this is the whole worry that I had, that it was the Safari browser. So I'm going to do something right now, team. I'm going to switch browsers, and it might degrade the quality of the camera because I'm unsure. I'm unsure I'm going to get the camera I want. So just give me a second. All right. Well, we should be back. One second. I'm going to make sure I have the right audio. Assalamu alaikum, Muslim Bitcoiner. What's stopping? Okay, I'll be seeing me. Okay. Now, what I've done is I've switched back over to Chrome. I only didn't use Chrome because it can't sense the iPhone camera. So you're going to get this is a 2021 iMac camera, believe it or not. It was terrible. Audio okay. Thank you, Cornel VM Photography. I appreciate, and I also appreciate the comments on the video. So thanks a lot. So we're going to go with this today. Better to have good audio than good video and bad audio. So we're going to go with it. All right. So back to Brazil. So as I was saying, the Joy Reid headline here. You get a dig on Florida, pretty strong, and you don't really have to address what's going on with Bolsonaro. It's not exactly like Trump. He wasn't there without his influence or anything like that, right? This seems to be pretty and motivated from the people. So the reactions out in the real world, so not the MSNBC world. So the best, Glenn Greenwald, who lives in Brazil and has a pretty good going on, had a few statements here. So he said that have gathered, and Lula is not in Brazil, and that was important because it's not the same as the Trump situation, where it was really easy to connect the dots between the actual storming of the Capitol buildings and Trump's presence and what he said. So it's not exactly the same, right? But nevertheless, he's putting what's different between the two cases, and I think that's important. And they're talking a lot here about how the police that were there were even taking selfies, and you could really see that the police were not necessarily unified in their control of protesters. We definitely did see one of these police cars run through a crowd, but we don't know who was driving it. We don't know what was going on at the time. So a little bit of fog of war around that stuff. I know, well, the great image that everyone's been sharing around is they have their own shaman, the buffalo hat guy that was in the actual Senate room. So it looks like there's a Brazilian version, but it turns out the photos of him that have gone viral were actually from about a year ago at a Bolsonaro rally. So it wasn't during the Brasilia event from yesterday, but pretty interesting similarity anyway. And things look pretty similar in a lot of ways. So this is Glenn Greenwald here talking about Bolsonaro and saying, remember, Bolsonaro himself left Brazil the last day of his presidency for the US. And he's living in the house of an ex-MMA fighter and hasn't commented on the events. He sent out a picture of himself eating some KFC and just being in America. Lula, so the guy who was waiting to be president, the guy who was sprung from jail by Bolsonaro, who managed to win, and what some people say is a stolen election. I have no proof, right? There's no proof on this show. I don't know exactly what happened. All I'm saying is there's people who say one province in particular, the only one that Lula won, was enough to change the entire country's popular vote and deliver him to victory. He won by such a large amount. And so Glenn Greenwald here mentioning that Lula giving this televised conference, calling the people that were protesting fascists and warning that they'll all pay under the force of law, and signed basically a martial law order, which is not being evenly kept around the country. As I just mentioned, we have some police that are doing it, some that aren't. They did manage to secure the buildings in the end, and about 170 people were arrested. No one died, but total property destruction. The Supreme Court, who a lot of people blame for what's going on, the presidential palace, all of them ransacked. We don't really know the exact rundown of how security forces were involved here, right? So as I said, it's fog of war, some on one side, some on the other side. It wasn't exactly what we saw in the American situation, where law enforcement was pretty much together. I think they kept a pretty good balance in the American case, except for the one tragic event of the veteran woman who was shot in the Capitol building, of course. But in general, one has to say that the police in January 6th in America probably had the right amount of sticking together and not being rough. And, who knows what came from on high, right? We've heard a lot about Nancy Pelosi and what happened there. And maybe, as I've mentioned at the beginning of this one, it was a read and react situation where this narrative of an insurrection was sort of, adapted on the fly and staged is the wrong word. Um, Narrative was constructed from that sort of early moment, right? So um, Bolsonaro not there, and that makes it kind of different. Here's Matthew Tiermond, who has been one of the best voices on the whole Brazilian case. I would say he's been on Tucker Carlson a few times. We've talked about him on the show a few times, and here he is going after all the kind of disinformation folks who are out there. So here's Cheyenne Sardar. I can't pronounce the person's name. Many apologies. I really am trying to pronounce it properly. Cheyenne Sardariz, pardon me. In scenes reminiscent of the January 6th Capitol riot, supporters of former Brazilian President Bolsonaro have invaded the federal Senate and upper houses of Brazil's National Congress over the false claims of a rigged election. And here's Matthew Tiermond saying, "Hey, disinformation expert, have you seen the machines or source code? Have you reported on the blockage of the military audit of the Supreme Court? Since I know the answer is no to both, you are an agent of disinformation. Shameful, lying, fraud. BBC News is disgusting propaganda." And here's the interesting thing that I took out of all the crazy images we've seen in Brazil and all that kind of stuff. And it's what Matthew Tiermond just said. And it's what someone has brought up in they've translated some of the banners that folks have been hanging at the actual protest, right? So one of the banners says, "Queremos o código fonte," and that means we want the source code. We want the source code. And that was in Matthew Tiermond's discussion yesterday with Mario Nawfal. So we've talked about Mario Nawfal before, right? He was the guy who got the original spaces going when SBF and the whole FTX thing happened. Elon Musk jumped in, and his Twitter Spaces has really blown up as a result, and he's become this sort of go-to Twitter Spaces for Twitter files dropping, and he keeps getting really interesting people that roll in. We've been following it here. Right, this isn't, he's not out there trying to tell anyone what to think or anything. That's not what I've seen from this Mario Nawfal guys. He's made some mistakes in hosting, hasn't always been the greatest host, but learning quick and getting on top of the target, following the stories really quickly, and he did it again here. He had Matthew Tiermond on the Spaces yesterday, and Matthew was debating with all kinds of people. Apparently it was a great Spaces. And this is where things get interesting, right? So Mario does come from this crypto world or whatever, right? But at least we know as Bitcoiners, right? As Bitcoiners and folks who have seen all of this industry spring up, crypto and blah, blah, blah. Nevertheless, we all, Bitcoiners and the crypto folks, have an understanding of systems design and consensus mechanisms and how networks can actually come to a form of credible consensus, right? What's credible? So we have a really unique understanding of the election issue in the United States and Brazil, because this is the kind of stuff we argue about all the time in our industry, right? Bitcoiners, of course, with what I argue is the correct approach, which is the simplest, most error-resistant, fault-tolerant system that can, manage a 50% plus one consensus mechanism with all kinds of distributed computing power involved, which means that it's really hard to game the system, right? It is security by design. And this idea of security by design, that it's built into the system inherently, is, primitive to what we believe we're doing here. So we are literate in the mechanics of the engineering that are being debated around elections around the world. And out of nowhere, right, we got the American situation where, again, I'm alleging no proof of any fraud whatsoever at all in the American election. But what I know is it provoked us to ask really interesting questions unrelated to Bitcoin, but actually related to the architecture of Bitcoin, because it's really a cryptography question in the end, right? If we're going to go to these digital ballots and these machines that do all of this stuff, well, of course, the data security and the engineering of the system is of utmost importance. And it just so happens that Bitcoiners have been arguing about this stuff for years. I mean, what do you think the big block debate was about? It's about systems very similar in design and function to the ones that we're questioning with the elections today. Yet we have no court that is capable of understanding the debate to the extent that we can understand it, right? We live and breathe these systems and the engineering and economic engineering that goes into their proliferation. And so we understand the weaknesses in a system, especially one that's unauditable. I mean, imagine. Our whole point is to argue about the security of the auditing system of the network that we're talking about, right? That's the whole point of Bitcoin, is that the audit trail is credible and inspires confidence. Therefore, the whole system is useful because you can actually audit it. We can't audit any election. There's no incredible or capable of auditing an election as things stand today. And we've talked a lot on this show about how Arizona, for example, we understand the trade-offs of systems like this, right? So Bitcoin, Ethereum, all these debates we've had over years make us understand that when you trade in one area, for example, ease of use, you might have to give up another area, which is security and or credibility. An election, for example, if it's done like in Israel, where you have a bunch of witnesses and humans come in with a paper ballot, put it in, everything's counted in the same room. There's no separate counting. The ballots have no chain of custody. There is nothing like that. It's done in the room. That's a pretty credible election, but it's hard to participate in because you have to go at the time and the date in the room. There's plenty of rooms and the day is long, but nevertheless, you have to adhere to those rules. It's not convenient at all. So the American system has chosen convenience in several jurisdictions, and that convenience does come with a cost benefit situation, right? There's things you have to give up, and you don't just, there isn't an option that is easy to use and totally credible to the maximum, right? You give up one for the other. And that's just the way it's built. There's no way around that. We understand those trade-offs when we look at systems like Bitcoin. So luckily, as people around the world are waking up, they're more or less getting educated in the networking architecture of Bitcoin as they go, without ever having to talk about Bitcoin, without ever having to involve themselves in Bitcoin. But what a launch it will be for Bitcoin, for people to understand the trade-offs, the transparency, auditability, all the things that normal Brazilians every day now, right? Because this is their life. This is them wanting to be under the yoke of a government they don't believe is legitimate. And here we have a case where you're going to have a bunch of just normal people learning architecture and auditability and all of those things, right? So that you see like Quermos Código Fonte, right? We want the source. I can't think of a more beautiful thing for us as Bitcoiners to see in political protests of this scale and size. So it's a win, right? It's a win. Here's Brandon. They can't even keep track of how many ballots they had at each step in the chain of custody. They need a Merkle tree, but they can't even do a simple tally. Yeah, exactly. I mean, and that's the thing about the Arizona election that we've learned, right? You're supposed to, even by law, it's one of these things where they're trying to add credibility to the ease of use system. They're supposed to be able to count the votes along every part of the chain of custody. They never even did that. So at any point, you could have slipped hundreds, 200, 300, 400, 500, 600. It doesn't matter. You could slip more in because we don't know how many there were at point A to point B to point C to point D, right? So that makes it not credible. But let's just stop now, right? And see big change in Brazil, this election thing, massive amount of education going on, right? Let's just take a tour now. Let's just go through the Americas quickly, right? Look at their neighbor, Argentina. We've spoken about Argentina recently when they won the World Cup. We did a whole show on Argentine history. We talked about, the messy history of the country and what's been going on there and the failures of their central bank over the years. And we talked about how, and this is not new information, right? Everyone has known that the void of legitimate monetary policy has left Argentina a shell of what it could be based on its potentiality and the things that are there, the human capital, the physical resources, all the pieces that are in place to make one of the most dynamic, wealthy countries in the world blossom, right? We've seen for a long time that it was economic and political mismanagement. So it's been for years that Bitcoiners have predicted that the off the shelf currency that separates money and state, Bitcoin, would be a natural fit for a place like Argentina. Well, here's a tweet from Bitcoin Magazine telling everyone, and I hadn't really seen this, right? That the leading Argentine presidential candidate said this: Bitcoin represents the return of money to the private sector. We can eliminate the central bank. And, he's got kind of like an Austin Powers look to him. He's got a bit of a fro and some sideburns. And so, people reacting to that look, Bowtied Bull saying it's good to see that Wolverine is pro Bitcoin now. And a few people mentioning the Austin Powers look too. Jessica Vaughn, right, who we respect a lot, had this interesting take on it, and I think she's right. She says recognizable hair is a differentiation that works in both politics and entertainment. What's good for Bitcoin is good for liberty. Exit the matrix, Argentina. And I think if you think about it like that, right, that this is someone who's just saying out loud what we've known for years, that that Argentina can adopt an off-the-shelf, pre-packaged currency that would allow them to avoid the thing that continues to make their country suffer and be limited from its enormous potential, right? So that's an amazing thing happening right there. Peter Zihan, who we talked about yesterday, had a lot to say. Let's move around the continent, right? So Brazil, we're learning about Bitcoin, or the people there are learning about the architecture of Bitcoin without actually learning about the architecture of Bitcoin. But nevertheless, directionally where we want to see things. Argentina, a presidential candidate, leading presidential candidate, openly saying we can eliminate the need for the central bank. We can separate state and money, and more or less, right? Mexico, yesterday we talked about the war going on that's broken out between a cartel and the National Defense Force. Peter Zihan having a lot to say yesterday on the potential for Mexico and America once all of this stuff gets sorted out. And he says here, third, America and Mexico, this is from his latest book, America and Mexico, and this is something that him and Rogan were talking about yesterday, and I watched the clip, and there's a lot of interesting points there, but his frame comes from his book, so I'm going to share the actual source material here. So he says, third, America and Mexico still have something more, and they certainly have more. There are some clouds on the horizon. While it is aging slowly, the American population is still aging. And while Mexicans are young, they are aging faster than Americans. At some point in the mid-2050s, the average American is highly likely to be older than the average American. But even in the worst case scenario, demographically speaking, the United States has something hardly anyone else in the world, of disorder we're all falling into: time. While others must figure out how to unwind and rewire their systems to design and implement a new ism in just a few years, the Americans and Mexicans have decades, at least until the 2050s. There is something to be said for being a late bloomer. Americans and their Mexican partners will be able to look across the world and learn from what everyone else has tried. But perhaps the most notable takeaway isn't that Americans, in league with the Mexicans, face the least traumatic adjustment to the world which will soon be, but instead that the future of the world is American. The math is pretty simple. America's population is more than young enough that even without Mexico or inward migration, its population can keep growing for at least a few decades. So he goes on to describe a lot about what we're seeing right now in global supply chains, what we've predicted on this show, that more or less China's demographics don't even lend to its previous role in global supply chains as the world's factory floor, as some people had described it, right? Apparently they're suffering greatly right now from the microchip sanctions, that whole industry having a lot of trouble over there, just losing human capital, as Peter Zihan had predicted. And what he's saying here, more or less, we're seeing in the actual marketplace where a lot of stuff that was in China has a much more appropriate home for America in Mexico. The demographics are good. All of that stuff can more or less get rebuilt. And America can at once take care of its immigration problem at the border simply by making Mexico and those other places where we're getting a lot of migration into America richer, right? More jobs down there, more capacity to improve their lives, grow their families, all that kind of stuff will help in the end America solve its supply chain problem and actually solve its border problem and solve its demographics problem and solve what some people said would be a critical flaw in the design of the American system, the supply chains that were too reliant on Chinese manufacturing. So there's a big chance all of that stuff can just move to Mexico. So there's another place that is just going to change, and so what's going to happen, right? Either there's going to be a war between America and the cartels, or there's going to be some form of exit plan, some form of how to become honest, really rich people. And we saw that happen in America 100 years ago, right? That happened during the Roaring Twenties. Where do you think the Kennedy family even came from, right? The Kennedy family, weirdly, were bootleggers who were total criminals and used the bootlegging money to speculate on Wall Street. And John F. Kennedy's dad is the guy who brought in a lot of the rules in the 1933 and 1934 Securities Acts that created the SEC. Right? That's JFK's dad. So they gave, the hen house to the fox when it came to making them legitimate, for lack of a better word. Right? They gave all these folks an off ramp. And either they do that in Mexico, and what happens if they do that in Mexico? If they give them an off ramp, well, they've got to convert massive amounts of dollars from the drug trade into something else altogether. What's it gonna be? I don't know. I don't know what it'll be, but that's a major financial change. That is a major um, um, component of shadow banking and the gray market, right? The gray economy is as big as the legit economy, right? The gray economy is as big as the legit economy. There's so much money going around that's from industries that are illegal that I've always thought that Bitcoin absorbing the gray market around the world because people want to keep things off the books. And we're going to talk about how that's happening as we continue our tour around the world here. How that's primed to continue to happen. So you get all of this money that suddenly wants to go legit, but if it gets on ramped into the U.S. dollar system, the opportunity to go legit isn't quite as clear, and you got to pay a little more probably, right? So maybe they'll do that. I don't know. I just think that there's a big opportunity for these folks when they pivot to legitimate stuff to get into things that are not controlled by U.S. institutions. So while they'll go legit, they don't have to go legit with those institutions. They can keep a degree of independence from them so that they're not, basically boxed in afterwards, right? So that's just a bit of game theory. I'm not sure, but that's big news to me. Now move up to the American, that's Mexico. Now we have the story in Brazil, but in Arizona, right? Very similar story and getting much more interesting. So it turns out that they had the first trial. We said that the judge did his best, had a few things that he thought were interesting, gave air to some stuff. But again, it always falls in elections back to this. Well, it's not enough of a number of votes for the overall election to change, so we probably won't change it. And they just say we don't have standing, and it wouldn't be enough, so dismiss it. But they don't actually look at source code and anything like that. So Kerry Lake is now on appeal, and it looks like enough stuff has been, enough of the hornet's nest has been rattled around that she thinks she can take it to the Supreme Court, where they might actually have an airing of things like code base and chain of custody and all these other questions. But it's enough that this woman, Jen Wright, and Jen Wright was the election integrity unit leader in the Arizona Attorney General's office. And it looks like with everything that's been going on, this person resign, saying I'm not going to be a part of this, right? So this person resigned, and immediately Arizona Central, a fake news outlet, published a story using government talking points from this newly elected Katie Hobbs administration, saying that she had been fired. So now what she's going to do is sue them, right? So she says, "Hey, AZ Central, this article is defamation. I resigned before Mays took office. Confirm it on LinkedIn. Look at the HR stuff." So she brings her receipt. She goes on to prove, like, the emails, the resignation letters, everything's there. This journalist made no attempts to contact me, and I headed the civil side of blah blah blah, and was never. She's just talking about what she had to do with the election. So she's going to sue these people now for defamation, and they haven't deleted the tweet, right? So it's one of these situations where they delete the tweet and admit that they had lied and done all this stuff, or they intentionally keep the tweet up and expose themselves to a defamation suit. So she's got them pretty well cornered. And again, this is another one of those instances where we're going to understand a lot more when this is done about things that are useful in understanding the corruption of our systems. And by seeing the corruption of our systems, especially when it comes to network architecture, the implicit base gets formed to understand Bitcoin the minute you turn your attention to it, right? You're already now literate in adversarial thinking and all the pieces that make Bitcoin so special. So that's what's going on there, right? So, think about it right away. You get all of these these parts of the Americas that are changing into something new. Even Canada, right? So Canada, you can take the flip side, right? Canada, being one of the last countries that, within their own delusion, is self-confident in its certainty that this liberal world order is going to continue, continues to create terrible relationships between its states. Justin Trudeau's dad created Western alienation as a concept in Canada, pushing Westerners and their concerns to the margins and just focusing, as we talked about yesterday, on Quebec and Ontario and what I call the empire on the St. Lawrence, and the Great Lakes, right? That whole area. And one day, this is where I think things could happen, right? So we're limiting now the power of the federal government in the United States, right? We've got Joe Biden, very weak president. Let's go Fetterman 2024 all the way, Joe Biden 2024 all the way. Because as we change the role of the president and it remains weak and not the JFK version of the job or the FDR version of the job, right? It remains this pathetic, weak, a little bit confused version of the job. You see the proliferation of American state leadership, the Floridas, even Californias, right? These governors take more profile, a lot more power, a lot more of their jurisdictions. One can easily imagine that the contract to join America, the United States of America, doesn't limit itself to what is there already, right? And a renegotiated federalism of Canada and a renegotiated federalism of the United States, there's every possibility new entities to join if they get a better deal. There's every opportunity in the world for some place like Alberta to realize that, well, wait a minute, if we join the United States gets a land bridge to Alaska, and they don't have to bother with all of this bullshit anymore, right? It's pretty appealing to a country that knows how to get its resources out, right? We've let Alberta languish, and it's one of the most valuable pieces of real estate in the world. There's more oil in Alberta than in Saudi Arabia, right? There's a lot of oil there. It's oil sands and kind of hard to get to, but it's not that hard to get to. We can do it, right? And it's everywhere. It's just absolutely everywhere. And what did Canadians do with it? Oh, they transported it by train across country, and that's the best we can do. And the trains sometimes blow up and take entire towns with them, right? A town near me got exploded, destroyed within the last 10 years. It's a crater. Lac Megantic, have a look. Unreal. A beautiful town near where I'm from was turned into a crater. It's one of the largest natural explosions in the history of the world that wasn't nuclear or something like that. Enormous destruction. And because a train filled with car after car after car after car of oil sands, whatever, blew up, right? It fell. I don't know what happened. It's a disaster. Right? Everyone died. It's terrible. We could, and then they say, "Oh, pipelines are dangerous because a fucking frog." Pardon me, I don't want to swear, because a frog might, drown in a leak of the thing, and the leaks happen. I don't want to say leaks don't happen in a pipeline; they're not that safe. But what do we want? Trains that blow up towns and kill everybody, or frogs that might get some oil in them and die? Right? Well, to me, I'm pro-human, so I'm for the no dying of people, and if a couple frogs don't make it, I'm okay. But that's just me. We can disagree. So, what happens when all of these countries start renegotiating and actually get rid of their local currencies and get rid of, because they don't work, get rid of their association of state and money, right? If they all do that and they're all working off of something else, like a Bitcoin standard, the flexibility for the domestic laws and how institutions are run increases greatly. And there is an opportunity to see new types of deals, right? Because we are entering a very different time, and a time when, who knows, maybe even the way American states relate to each other changes, and even in the contract they have together is altered, and these things can happen naturally. I don't think you have to write a law for it to happen, right? It can just organically grow in that direction just by the nature of the founding documents of the United States. So totally possible that we have this renegotiated thing, right? So let's keep going around the world, right? We talked yesterday, and this is what's going on in France. They've got all these protests on inflation right now, right? That's an amazing thing. You get people complaining in an important way about something that's touching them every day. You get Germany, right? Germany did an amazing thing. Here's, I criticize the Germans quite a bit, but here's an interesting thing, right? All the trouble they had recently with losing their Russian natural gas supply. Wall Street Silver shared a really cool data visualization today with one of these wheels. So it's a pie graph like this, and each color denotes the source of the country where Germany was getting its natural gas from, and then it animates it over time, so you see the different proportions and distributions, and you see the clock sort of run down very quickly on Russian natural gas, and you find out what they did to do that, and this is what Wall Street Silver mentioned. He said Russia supplied 64% of Germany's gas in May 2021. Today it's 0%. And how did they do it? Well, engineers in Germany built Germany's first import terminal for liquid natural gas in 200 days, right? They slashed red tape and made it happen. And put that in context. In 200 days, Germany did something that you'd have thought them incapable of doing in their certainty they had figured everything out, and their certainty that their legal systems and their bureaucratic systems and controls for engineers were the best in the world. Here's a country that was able to just say, wait a minute, let's just have faith in our builders, faith in our engineers, and now they're out there running havoc in the world, because now everyone's going to sell a product at their terminal for higher prices, which is jacking the price up in all sorts of other parts of the world. So it's not a perfect fit, but for them, and to see this happen, it's one of the first good things I've seen come out of Germany in a while. It's not related to Bitcoin necessarily, but it is part of what I think is an appetite for an increased energy literacy. And so maybe we'll have more German attendees at Bitcoin 2023 in Miami, because it's going to be all about energy literacy. That is one of the main trajectories I think the next run in Bitcoin is going to be built from. We were already built, we already did this, we're going to disintermediate Wall Street thing, and all the shit coins were created around that. But, it definitely disintermediated Wall Street in its own way. But that was only one way of seeing the world. The economics is really important, and we've understood a lot, and we continue to understand a lot. And we're going to have a lot of programming on financial literacy in Miami for sure. That's still our bread and butter and where we come from and all the rest of it. But I think the energy literacy part is as important and will be as influential. We've all learned about the financial literacy things we didn't know about before Bitcoin, and how, I've even shared my story that, I was a lawyer. I had a science degree, a liberal arts degree, law degree, went to school in Europe, uh, lived in Asia, um, worked for the Canadian Senate Banking Committee, worked in all kinds of high level executive branch politics. I was a financial illiterate until I learned about Bitcoin. I mean, honestly, a financial illiterate. And I had as much education, the best education the world offers in this in the era that I grew up in. I mean, by far. I just saw someone share something today. I shared it on Twitter about the French education system and how hard it is. And it was how critical they grade their students. And I remember this, it's true. Like if you get everything's on 20 in the French schools, and like a 12 on 20 is a great grade, right? It's amazing. And they showed the stamp that one teacher had, and it was calling his students a crook when they would write something. It's like, you're a crook. Really mean stuff, right? And it was always that way, always that way. It's still that way now, I would imagine. I went to a fancy school in France, and indeed, the teachers would just cut you off, and if you had something to say in class, they just say you're stupid. I don't want to talk to you. You're dumb. They did stuff like that. It's funny. That's there. But this is the most. I think here's the last European story for the day. So just how much things are changing in the Americas, now over in Europe. France up in arms. Germany learning hard lessons and important lessons. But this is the one I like the best. We've talked about Meloni in Italy for a long time, and really impressed with her persuasion, really impressed with her rhetorical abilities, right? We love the use of the African central bank and France central bank colonial imagery to frame discussions around Italy and Libya and immigration and all of that stuff, right? Really, probably the most clever approach to European politics that I've seen in this era. And she came out and supported and helped enact a really important measure recently in Italy, which is under 60 euros, European or Italian merchants, coffee shops, everyone can deny. So that forget about going cashless in Italy, right? Forget about going cashless. She went the other way. 60 euros and below, any merchant can deny card use, only cash. They instituted a way for them to actually have only cash for their small businesses. Now, there's people saying, here's what the person who wrote the article name is Amy Kasman, right? Amy Kasman. And she writes it like a travel article, right? It's great. She wrote it for the Financial Times. She's like, oh my God, I was in India and Italy, and it's like so hard to pay with cash now. Gosh. I mean, that's how she wrote it. It's absurd. So here's what a quote from her article. So she says, I get that Meloni, never a fan of big banks, wanted to side with small business owners raging against big capital. Yet Italy, with its precarious public finances, cannot afford to drive economic activity underground beyond the tax man's reach. So she thinks, this woman thinks that Meloni is like concerned about the public finances of Italy, and therefore will go back on one of these liberty things around cash. This came out of her mouth. Right? This is a writer not understanding human beings, right? Meloni's power comes from not caring about public finance to nickel and diming regular Italians. And this is a writer who thinks that she's just going to go do it tomorrow because the balance sheet now matters to her, right? No liberal is caring about a balance sheet. No one cares. They'll buy everything, right? She's going to buy votes just like anybody else. So one can only hope that what she has in store leads to the result that this woman, in her game theory, says is going to mean Meloni goes back and wants to get taxes in and help public finances. I think Meloni is a burn it down kind of person and won't mind if the euro collapses, won't mind if big change comes. That's just my reading. But nevertheless, she did an important thing for the world and for Italy, which is she supported the use of anonymous cash for small transactions, and indeed gave her people negotiating power when it comes to financing the clown world. So great news. Maybe one day I will. We're set down here now in the South, and maybe one day I will do a show on my own tax strategies and help you guys see that for very little money. This is not. I do not live in. It doesn't cost a lot to do what I do, and you save a lot. Like, it pays for itself in the end if you do the stuff. So we'll talk about the stuff, and maybe it'll be helpful. Billy writes, we have the same education background, political science, lawyer, well-traveled, and same, was still totally financially illiterate. Yeah, Billy, isn't it nuts? Isn't it nuts? It's crazy. Like, how is that possible? Bob the Builder says, I'm from Italy. I can tell you that Maloney is pretty much the same as the previous gov, sadly. Well, I'm sorry to hear that, Bob. I guess I can believe that too. I mean, we're not here to put faith in politicians, right? That's not what we're doing. We're just seeing if one of them joins a side that will tip things in our balance. So we're not, we think that the fights that everyone are having in America and Europe and even voting is still worthwhile, right? It's still worthwhile. And we should participate, and we should try to influence things, but we can't make the success of Bitcoin dependent on anyone like a Maloney or any of these people, right? We just have to be opportunistic and see if they can help us. And there you go. Dex, we only have faith in Fetterman over here. Yes, we need Fetterman. We need him. Bud says, please talk about your tax strategy one day. It's got some nice, it's nice and smooth. It's a good one. You guys are gonna like it. I'll do one on it shortly, maybe around before tax time anyway. I got to be careful because those mother effers look out for this stuff. Politicians calling out their own system is a good thing, I think, is P-Man Van saying, I think about Maloney. Yeah, again, right, like even here's how disgusting the focus, framing, messaging in the world is. Like just think about this for a second. Billy and I talking here, connecting over being financially literate, even though we had all this experience. It goes even further. Think about it. I'm in Bitcoin for how many years? I speak perfect French. I come from the French world. I live in the French world. Until Bitcoin 2022, I had no idea. I feel stupid, but I had no idea. When I heard it on stage, the extent to which the Bank of France manipulated the francs in Africa, I did not know that, which is crazy. Like, I make no excuse for not knowing it. I'm not going to blame the world, but it is something else that information like that hadn't really come across my eyes. I mean, I think it's something else, like that wasn't discussed openly, and it took someone like Maloney to make an issue about it. So that itself is remarkable as far as I'm concerned. I'm pretty attuned to what's going on all over the place, and I'll take responsibility for a blind spot on Africa, but I'm not ignorant about Africa. Like, it's a complicated place, but I'm not a zero, and it's embarrassing that I didn't know it, and I will take responsibility for not knowing it. But I still have anger that's nowhere to go about not, right? So I'm going to find out not who to blame, but where that anger, because it's bullshit that I didn't know about that. I mean, and I went to Sciences Po in France. Like, this is a school that is not there to make France some great. It's not a propaganda house, right? They're not trying to. We criticize France all day at that school. So how the hell was this story not? How do we not know? That's what I don't understand. I mean, at our school we literally studied France as a country, all the islands, all the everything, how it got that way, why it's different than the English stuff, and why they still had their territories around the world and all of that stuff. We didn't do it. So anyway, all right, team. Did I miss anything? I think that's all we got today. Well, anyway, big news, right? This is learning about systems. This is big change. It looks like the fourth turning happening all around the world, and we're on schedule. And while some people might say all of this looks crazy, the world is crazy, to us Bitcoiners, it looks like what we predicted. This is on schedule. This is what it's supposed to look like, and we'll be there at the next bull run, and everyone's going to say, well, how did you guys know? How did you know that you were the solution to energy finance? Well, how did we know? We knew it from the beginning, guys. We knew it. Bob Builder says, one of the thing I know about Sciences Po is that the previous director is the leader of the left party here in Italy, and most politicians from the left here in Italy are under payroll of France. Wow, I didn't know that. I didn't know that, Bob. I believe it. I believe it. I believe it. I believe it. As I said, I'll share this last anecdote about Sciences Po, which I had a great time. I've met some of the nicest people I've ever met in my life there. Still friends. Still go and see them. But here's the thing: the way that school works is only the top students can get in. So they have to do these concours, like a test. And if they get the test, they're in. And it's colorblind. It's everything you want, right? Everything you think is going to make a great system. And anyone can make it. Anybody can make it, right? Except the test is really hard. And who do you think makes it? It's all the rich kids. And because it is 100% state-sponsored school, and remember, the reason it's there is that Charles de Gaulle believed that the reason why the Nazis it was so easy for the Nazis to create occupied France and occupied Vichy was because of the lack of a strong civil service, the lack of strong bureaucracy and talented people running France. So his whole thing was to create out of the school a generation of people who would never be swayed by a Nazi invasion force or anything like that. And what ended up happening was, sure, it's free, you don't pay any tuition, only the rich kids get in. I mean, the ones whose parents have trained them from birth to pass the test, which is so hard. And remember, we talked in this show just about Cretan and on the stand. Like it's a hard process. It's really tough, really alienating. They go to school 6 days a week, unlike American kids. That's the whole time, right? They have a bunch of cutoffs as they get older. They get cut off at I think 11, where they have to decide on different types of junior highs. They get another cutoff later where they decide on different schools. It just keeps going. And what ends up happening is the kids who had the best parents, who trained them to pass all of these tests, are the ones who end up in Sciences Po. So this is what made me very pro-American. I was like, they would sit there and say, oh, you poor Americans and your high tuition and what's it like and da-da-da-da. I'd never been around such rich people in my whole life. And I said, well, how is it that you guys get it for free and you're still so sure America sucks? And is it okay that a bunch of poor people have to pay for your lifestyle, or you just call it what it is in America, a tax on people, tax on the rich? Tuition is a tax on the rich. They're going to school anyway. Charge them. And then, the way the American system works in its ideal form, if you go to Harvard, the school is so rich that if you can't pay, like they say, well, they'll just pay for you. Like they have enough money. They got billions of dollars. No student will ever not go to Harvard because they can't pay. It's not going to happen because they're rich, right? So what's better? I mean, the French system is a really good education, but it doesn't lead to equality or anything like that. Right? It's the least of it. So that experience, seeing that up front, really made me pro-American at the time. All right, team. Thanks for coming. We're going to see you tomorrow, as long as the sun is up and Bitcoin's running. But I have strong confidence we're going to see each other tomorrow. And we should be back in business. We should be back in business. And I'm going to figure out this dang browser thing too. I don't know what the heck happened, but it looks like at least Cornel VM photography, at least we figured out that it was the Safari browser, I believe, that's causing that audio thing. So I can't use that one anymore, unfortunately. It had the camera, so we'll see.